Chinese Revolution was victorious, 1949. 1/4 of humanity has stood up. The Soviet Union was extremely helpful in the beginning to the Chinese people. It gave them loads of aid. And the first 5 years of the Chinese Revolution were called the period of national rehabilitation. And they started building things in China that were considered basic everywhere else. For example, levees, right? So that when there was a flood, it didn't wipe out the entire city. They constructed, the first highways, the first schools, that the country had ever had. The period of national rehabilitation. They repeatedly made attempts to get recognized by the United Nations. However, the United Nations would not recognize them. The Korean War took place, and at first China wasn't involved. The Korean War began with the northern half of Korea had been liberated by the Red Army, and the southern half of Korea had not been, because the atomic bombs had been dropped before the southern half of Korea could be liberated by the Red Army, and so it stopped. And so the northern half of Korea was constructing socialism under a coalition government between the Christian Party, the Social Democratic Party, and the Korean Workers' Party. It was a coalition government. And the southern part was run by a military general who had been a Japanese collaborator named Syngman Rhee.
Yeah.
And the war...
And he was Roman Catholic.
Oh, I didn't realize that. That's interesting. And so the Korean War began with the people in North Korea who had the support of the unions and a lot of popular organizations in South Korea attempting to liberate, the rest of their country and unify it. And the slogan, of course, was "Korea is one," which is still the slogan used rapidly by the movement for Korean unification. So they tried to liberate the rest of their country. The U.S. came in, and it was the first of the wars that aren't a war in the U.S. Constitution, right? Because to declare war is a constitutional issue.
Yes.
All of Congress has to vote for it. However, they knew they couldn't do that, so Truman had a police action. They called it a police action. And it was also the first time that when a country in the socialist bloc went to war with other countries, not all socialist countries supported it. For example, Tito in Yugoslavia sided with the United States. In 1948, Tito had came out with a statement calling Stalin was a evil dictator, and he made overtures to the West. And when the Korean War opened up, and there was war between the northern half of Korea and the southern half, Tito sided with the United States in the war, and that was a significant setback, and he was roundly denounced. Interestingly enough, the loudest denouncers of Tito for doing that were Albania, his fellow Slavs, and Enver Hoxha wrote huge polemics and pamphlets against Yugoslavia for taking that position. Yugoslavia also at that time was they were engaging in market reforms, and they were replacing the state ownership of the means of production with cooperatives. But the cover they were using for it is they called it an advance. They said, Soviet Union, they're stuck in socialism, but by dismantling the state-run economy and having these factories competing with one another, we're moving towards communism. But really it was the opposite. They were consolidating with the U.S. They were being a base for anti-Sovietism. They were getting funds from the U.S. At that time. The U.S. started funding Yugoslavia as a bulwark against the Soviets. And it's kind of interesting. You'll see, and even now you'll hear right-wingers talk about how the U.S. funded communists all throughout the Cold War. What they're referring to is the U.S. funded Yugoslavia because Yugoslavia was the first anti-Soviet communist state. Right? Tito, in the name of being angry at Stalin, started receiving a great deal of funds from the U.S. and started assisting the U.S. and the U.S. was assisting him, and that was kind of an interesting relationship. So 1952, the U.S. landed hundreds of thousands of troops. They marched in and they devastated the northern part of Korea, bombing. Thousands are killed, and they got up right to the Chinese border. And at that point, the Chinese did get involved, and when they got involved, it was a matter of a week, and they forced the U.S. back to the 38th parallel, which is the thing now. But before the Chinese got involved, Douglas MacArthur told the Chinese people, in a telegram to Mao Zedong, said he would drop 6 atomic bombs on China if they got involved in the war. And that caused kind of a scandal because Douglas MacArthur had done so without the permission of President Truman, so he was fired. But, the Republicans and McCarthy and all of them rallied behind Douglas MacArthur because he had the courage You
Well,
know,
it was more than not the permission. He had been expressly told not to
Oh, wow.
do this. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, the Chinese, the Red Army went in, and one of the people who died in the Korean War, there were hundreds of thousands of Chinese who died driving the U.S. out of the northern half of the Korean Peninsula. One of those who died was Mao's own son, Mao Zedong's own son. So imagine the Bush twins having died in Iraq. That will never happen, right? But Mao Zedong's own son perished in the war. And it was a period at the time of the Soviet Union, you know, and they write these glowing statements, you know, the Soviet Union, the greatest friend of the people of China. There was thousands and thousands of, you know, engineers, technicians were sent to the Soviet Union, or sent to China to provide aid. Thousands of Chinese Communist Party members were in the Soviet Union getting their education, getting trained in Moscow. There was a good period of relations. Stalin died in 1953. And then in 1956, Khrushchev came out with his secret speech, which was only secret from Russians and Chinese people. It was, and the entire issue of the New York Times was the secret speech. You know, it was all over the West, but they didn't share it with the people of Russia. It was secret from them because Stalin was so loved by the people of Russia. To malign Stalin so dangerously would be dangerous for the Khrushchev faction. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union had split between Molotov, who had been Stalin's right-hand man, and Khrushchev, who had also been close to Stalin, but he was for what he called de-Stalinization. And they announced that their program in light of Stalin's death was they announced the three peacefuls: peaceful coexistence between the socialist countries and the capitalist countries, peaceful competition between a socialist economy and a capitalist economy, and peaceful transition, meaning they no longer believed in revolution and overthrowing capitalism, but they would, you know, elect communists to office, and gradually they would peacefully transform the economy. And at first, in the name of denouncing Stalin, at first the Chinese were not openly hostile to that. In fact, Mao Zedong echoed a lot of what Khrushchev was saying, but the key difference in the way they did it is Mao's response to the attacks on Stalin was to open up to the left. Whereas Khrushchev's response was de-Stalinization, you know, was arresting the leaders of the party who refused to denounce Stalin, you know, privatizing sections of the land, privatizing sectors of the Soviet economy. Mao's response was to launch what he called the 100 Flowers campaign. And he argued that the reason, you know, one of Stalin's biggest mistakes was not allowing dissent, you know, and keeping the party bureaucracy, maintaining control of what was printed in the press and what art was produced. And so Mao launched what was called the 100 Flowers campaign. And the slogan was actually, it was a slogan by, it was an old Chinese proverb, but he revived it. And it was the slogan, it was, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend." And what he did is he opened up the press, and he made it so that the press in China, the People's Daily, the Red Flag, the Beijing Review or Peking Review, these were not just organs of whatever the party had. You know, it didn't have one idea in it. You had competing ideas: the right-wing faction, the left-wing faction. The idea was that it would open up, and so there was all kinds of debate and discussion through all of that. There was talk. You know, some elements they didn't want the Communist Party to be the domineering party. They wanted the Communist Party to split, and they wanted to be multi-party rule. There were other factions that wanted, you know, and I mean, it was just a period of mass, you know, mass dissent, you know, called forth by Mao Zedong. And he said also, the other thing he said is that science itself has no class nature. Truth is truth, right? It's got no class bias. Right? And he was for art, but he said art should be able to criticize society. You know, art should not try to be art for art's sake. It should be political, but the political message shouldn't be, you know, regulated by the state. It should be open. And in addition to that, they launched the Great Leap Forward, which was an economic program in which it was first there was the first 5-year plan, which had happened prior to that, and then there was the Great Leap Forward, which was a move even quicker towards socialism, building up state-run industries. China had never had any steel production. In China. China had never had anything like that, and so Mao did that in response. And interestingly enough, during this period, the Hungarian Revolt of 1956 occurred. And at first, the Chinese, for example, Yugoslavia was openly supportive of it because it was anti-Soviet. And China met with the leadership of the Hungarian Revolt. And it was Zhou Enlai, and he met with the leadership. And when he determined that they were He said that they were not fighting for a more pure socialism in Hungary. They made clear they were a nationalist revolt against the Soviet state, and that the leadership of the Hungarian revolt included priests, fascists, you know, and all that. Mao denounced that, and the Communist Party denounced the Hungarian revolt in 1956, and even sent some of its own followers to volunteer to put it down. And this was the first first Chinese intervention in Europe since the days of Genghis Khan.